Let's begin with the foundations. This is another lecture. Today we discuss the Trojan War in Greek mythology and its historicity, how a legendary siege near the Dardanelles became both scripture for heroism and a puzzle for archaeology. I am Alexei. Thank you for listening. It is important to understand that myths are not mere stories for the ancients. They are also how a culture remembers what it cannot precisely date.
Hi, I am Priyanka, and I am excited to ask a few deceptively simple questions today, mostly to clarify what we think we know and why we think we know it. So, I guess we can start by thinking about the most basic definition. What is the Trojan War in simple terms?
To frame our discussion, in simplest terms, the Trojan War is a legendary conflict between the Achaeans, that is to say the Greeks, and the city of Troy. It is sparked when Paris of Troy takes Helen from Menelaus of Sparta, and it culminates in a long siege by a coalition of Greek kings against a wealthy Anatolian city near the Dardanelles.
And in more scientific terms, where do we place it, and what categories of evidence are we talking about?
In this context, we locate Troy at Hisarlik in modern Turkey. The traditional time frame falls in the late Bronze Age, roughly the 1200s to early 1100s BC. Our analytical elements are epic poetry, archaeology, and comparative philology. We observe that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey provide the core poetic frame. The so-called epic cycle supplies episodes before and after. Archaeology at Hisarlik reveals multiple settlement layers, with a late Bronze Age destruction known as Troy 7, and Near Eastern tablets hint at conflicts among Aegean and Anatolian powers. Definitions that will help. Achaeans are the Greeks in Homeric diction. The Dardanelles is the strait near which ancient Greeks placed Troy. The Nostoi are the homecomings of Greek heroes. The Palladium is a protective statue of Athena, and the late Bronze Age collapse refers to the wide regional upheavals around the same century. Moving forward, why does this matter today? First, the Trojan stories have shaped ideals of courage, honor, and divine justice in Western literature for nearly 3 millennia. Second, they teach us how cultural memory compresses many events into a single, resonant narrative. And third, the case exemplifies how texts and trenches, as it were, can enrich or correct each other.
It makes me wonder about the shift in scholarly attitudes. For a long time, people said it was pure myth. Then, archaeology at Hisarlik, starting with Frank Calvert and Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, and refined by later researchers, changed perceptions. So, moving on. What are the most useful baseline facts we should carry? 2 quick points I like. The Iliad covers only a few days in the 10th year of the war, not the whole war. Also, the famous wooden horse is not in the Iliad. The full version becomes canonical much later in Virgil's Aeneid.
Clearly, chronologically, traditional dates cluster in the 1200s to early 1100s BC. Eratosthenes calculated 1194 to 1184 BC, and these dates roughly correlate with the destruction layer at Troy 7 and the broader late Bronze Age collapse, though we should not infer identity by mere proximity. Thucydides, writing centuries later, infers that the Greeks lacked resources to maintain a total blockade, hence years of raiding and episodic battles. This explains why Troy could receive reinforcements until nearly the end, and why deception, not encirclement, decided the issue. As for scale, the catalogue of ships imagines something on the order of 1,000 pentaconters, which is either a memory of impressive mobilization or a poetic device to dramatize coalition warfare. In simpler terms, it is the Bronze Age equivalent of the Eternal Group Project, Everyone brings different strengths and grievances, and one argument over a captive can imperil the whole operation. Before we get to the complexities, a personal note. I have been fascinated by how a poem about wrath and pity intersects with a hill of burned brick and sherds, how the Iliad closes with a funeral rather than a victory, and how spade and stanza together teach us to separate evidence from embroidery without losing the humanity of either. Let's transition to another aspect. Three distinct questions will structure our inquiry today: the historical question, a counterfactual, and an open research frontier.
I've been wondering about this. Did the Trojan War really happen?
Arguably, there is a historical core. Excavations at Hisarlik show an impressive citadel with multiple rebuilds and a late Bronze Age destruction layer. And Hittite diplomatic tablets describe Western Anatolian polities and conflicts, which many scholars align with an Aegean power, and a city that could map to the later Greek memory of Troy. We can infer that episodes of warfare in the Troad during the 13th to 12th centuries BC were plausible and even likely. Yet the 10-year siege with named heroes, divine quarrels, and a giant wooden stratagem is poetry rather than reportage.
How reliable are those sources, like the site layers and the tablets? Can we say they prove a single war?
It is crucial to understand that they are circumstantial. They anchor possibilities and constrain fantasies, but they do not narrate the Iliad. The tablets are diplomatic and often opaque. The archaeology records destructions without naming culprits. And Homer blends Bronze Age motifs with later Iron Age sensibilities. Poetic anachronisms, formulaic composition, and the loss of most of the epic cycle make a definitive single conflict hard to extract. Many scholars therefore prefer a synthesis model. Several expeditions and raids later coalesced into one grand war in cultural memory.
To shift gears a bit, what if the Trojans had burned the wooden horse, as Laocoon and Cassandra urged?
Speaking of decisive moments, that counterfactual is illuminating. If the Trojans had destroyed the horse, the commando inside could not have opened the gates. The Greek fleet lurking at Tenedos would have lacked its midnight signal, and a war of attrition would likely have resumed. Given Thucydides' inference about limited resources, we might expect coalition fatigue to accelerate, Troy's inland lines to hold, and an eventual negotiated settlement to be plausible. The symbolic landscape of myth would shift. No iconic sack, fewer sacrileges in temples, and thus perhaps a gentler cycle of nostoi, without quite so many storms and assassinations in the aftermath.
Would that have changed Greek unity? The war is often presented as a pan-Greek coalition. If the horse failed, does the glue come unstuck?
Fundamentally, yes. A drawn-out stalemate would test the oath that bound Helen's suitors to support Menelaus. We observe in the poems how quickly honor disputes nearly implode the camp. Without a decisive endgame, the coalition might fragment into regional interests once more. Culturally, the shared memory of a glorious capture of Troy becomes less crisp. The unifying story that Greeks and later Romans told about themselves would look different, and later authors might have chosen other touchstones for collective identity.
Building on that, what remains unanswered about the Trojan War that scholars are still actively debating?
Several core issues persist. First, whether the saga reflects one major conflict or a braided memory of multiple campaigns. Second, the dating and attribution of specific destruction layers at Hisarlik to any Greek action at all. Third, the status of certain traditions, the authenticity of the catalog of ships as a historical roster versus a poetic construct, and variant episodes like Iphigenia's fate or the Phantom Helen that reveal how malleable the tradition was within antiquity itself. This brings us to method: how to align fragmentary texts with material evidence without forcing either to say more than they can.
Can we maybe now look at current research directions? What would actually move the needle on these questions?
We can infer progress on several fronts. Archaeologically, continued stratigraphic refinement at Hisarlik and broader regional surveys in the Troad can clarify settlement hierarchies and destruction horizons. Microarchaeology of fire layers can distinguish earthquake, accident, or warfare, and residue analyses can illuminate provisioning and siege logistics. Textually, further work on Hittite and related Anatolian corpora may better situate Western polities within international networks, and comparative studies of oral epic can model how historical events evolve in song. Finally, environmental reconstructions of the late Bronze Age collapse give us boundary conditions. If many systems were failing at once, then a coalition war remembered as the Trojan War fits a wider pattern of stress in the Eastern Mediterranean.
So I guess that kind of sums it up. A legendary war with potential historical roots, a coalition that could not quite choke a city, and a finale decided by ritual misrecognition and a wooden stratagem that Homer himself left off stage.
To summarize, we defined the Trojan War and its setting. We weighed historicity against poetry. We considered the counterfactual of burning the horse, and we outlined open questions where archaeology and philology still have work to do. If today's topic intrigued you, the Late Bronze Age collapse is the natural sequel. It provides the macro context within which any historical Troy must be placed.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, Professor.
This concludes our lecture for today. Until next time.